tariffs just became a tax machine. And the part nobody tells you is that the receipt is already printing. In October 2025, the United States collected about $31.4 billion in net customs duties, the highest single month ever recorded. It beat the prior record from September, about $29.7 billion. And it was more than 4 times what came in during October the year before, about $7.3 billion. That is not trade theory. That is a cash register ringing at the border. Here is why this matters. $31.4 billion in a month is roughly $377 billion in a year if it kept that pace. It will not always keep that pace. But the point is the scale. That is no longer pocket change. That is a revenue stream big enough to change politics, big enough to change corporate strategy, and big enough to change how prices behave even when the economy looks calm on the surface. And while that border cash register was ringing louder, the side door that made cheap online imports feel like magic was being welded shut. For years, if a package was under about $800, it could slide in under a duty-free rule that most people never heard of. You did not feel tariffs on a $5 cable or a $12 phone case because that rule helped the cheap end of e-commerce move like a river. Then, in early May of 2025, low-value packages from China and Hong Kong stopped getting that duty-free treatment. Later, by late August of 2025, the change expanded so that shipments from all countries were pulled into the customs entry and duty collection machinery. So here's the mystery that should have been front-page news. If tariffs are supposed to punish foreign exporters, why are United States customs duty receipts exploding? And if the receipts are exploding, who's really paying? You did that. You chased low prices. You saved a few dollars on a cart by clicking the cheapest listing and telling yourself it was just global efficiency. You paid later because when a country turns tariffs into a cash machine, the bill does not float in the air. It lands on somebody, and if you follow the chain long enough, it lands on households. Stay with me and I will show you who pays, how the bill travels from a dock to a shelf, and why even companies that do not import a single product directly can still take a hit when tariffs and border friction rise. And there is a prize at the end of this story. You are going to walk away with a simple way to estimate the tariff tax on any product category and 3 weekly dials that tell you when pressure is building before the headlines explain it. Before we move, like this video, subscribe and share it with one friend who still believes the foreign country pays the tariff like a parking ticket. If that were true, the border would be free money. Reality is messier. Messier is where the money is. Now let us strip the emotion away and look at the chain. A tariff is a tax charge at the border on the declared value of an imported good. That is the first layer, the obvious layer. But the real story begins after the first payment, because the importer does not swallow that cost out of kindness. The importer either pushes the cost backward to the supplier, or pushes it forward to the buyer, or splits it in a way that preserves survival. Think of a tariff like a weight you attach to a balloon. The balloon does not disappear. The balloon drops until it finds a new height where the air pressure balances the weight. Prices behave the same way. Add weight at the border, the price system sinks until somebody else picks up the weight. So who picks it up? Here's the mistake people make. They imagine one product, one tariff, one price change. In real life, a product is a stack of costs, and tariffs sit inside that stack like a wedge. And when you push a wedge into a stack, you do not just add the wedge. You change the geometry of the whole thing. Let me show you the receipt math in plain language. Imagine an item that costs $100 landed into the United States. That is the cost after it is produced and shipped to the port, but before it reaches the store. Now a tariff of 25% is applied. The importer pays $25 at the border, so the new landed cost is $125. Now the importer sells to a retailer. The retailer has to cover rent, wages, returns, fraud, marketing, and the quiet monster called shrink. Retail is not a charity, so the retailer applies a margin. If the retailer runs a gross margin of 40%, that does not mean they add $40. It means the cost is 60% of the selling price. If costs is $125 and that is 60%, the selling price becomes a bit above $200. Now compare it to the old world. If the cost was $100 and cost was 60%, the selling price was about $167. So the tariff did not just add $25 to your shelf price. It pushed the shelf price up by something closer to $40 because the margin structure amplified the increase. That is why people feel tariffs like a punch even when the tariff rate looks modest. You did that, you saw a tariff rate and assumed the price change would be the same as the tariff. You saved yourself from doing the math. You paid because the math does not care what you assumed. Now, stack the next layer. Even when the tariff is a percentage, the border process adds fixed costs that hit cheap items like a hammer. Customs entry, classification, brokerage, processing, sometimes extra inspections, delays that turn into storage charges. A $2 fee on a $200 item is noise. A $2 fee on a $6 item is a shock. That is why the cheap end of e-commerce feels it first. Not because the cheap end is evil, because the cheap end has no room to absorb fixed costs. That brings us to the part that makes this story explosive in 2025. The Minimis pipeline. When packages under about $800 slipped in with duty-free treatment, millions of small items were effectively protected from the normal tariff machinery that created a business model around small, cheap shipments. Direct to consumer, shipped like confetti. A $10 gadget could arrive at your door with a price that felt impossible. Then the side door started closing. And when you close a side door, the first thing that happens is not that the product vanishes. The first thing that happens is friction. Forms, delays, fees, returns become more expensive. Fraud becomes more expensive. And the most brutal part is that the friction is not proportional. It is lumpy. The same kind of paperwork burden that barely matters on a $300 item can destroy the economics of a $7 item. So the cheap end gets heavier first, and then the heavier cost creeps upward into categories you did not expect. You did that. You trained your brain to expect endless cheap imports. You saved money for a while. You paid when the same supply chain got forced to wear boots instead of sneakers. Now zoom out and watch the political economy, because this is where the controversy comes from and where comments explode. Tariffs are being used as revenue, not only as leverage revenue. In fiscal year 2024, net customs duties were about $77 billion. In fiscal year 2025, net customs duties were about $195 billion. That is an increase of about $118 billion in a single year. Now compare that to the deficit. The annual deficit has been around $1.8 trillion. So even $195 billion does not solve the deficit. It is about 1/10 of a $1.8 trillion deficit. It is not a cure, but it is big enough to tempt politicians because it is a tax that can be sold as somebody else paying. And that is the trap, because it is not somebody else paying. It is a chain of payments. Foreign exporters may cut prices a bit to stay competitive, yes, but the weight still has to be carried. If the exporter cuts price, it is carried by their margin. If they do not, it is carried by importer margin, retailer margin, or consumer wallets. In many past episodes of tariffs, the evidence showed the incidents landed heavily inside the importing country through higher prices and lower real income. So when you hear someone promise tariffs will be painless, you now know what they are counting on. They are counting on you not following the receipt. You did that. You listened to slogans. You saved time. You paid because slogans do not pay invoices. Now bring this into the companies you care about, because viewers do not come here for ideology. They come for the money map. Start with the obvious winners. Domestic producers in sectors where tariffs make imports more expensive. If you put a tariff wall in front of imported steel, domestic steel producers can see pricing power and better utilization, at least until domestic supply expands or demand cools. Names like Nucor and Steel Dynamics become relevant because their realized prices and volumes can improve when imports are priced out. But it is not a free lunch. If tariffs raise input costs for downstream manufacturers, demand can weaken, so the benefit can be real and still cyclical. It depends on the economy. Now look at domestic manufacturing tied to strategic policy. Companies like First Solar can benefit when import competition is restricted and domestic build-out is supported by incentives and protection. The mechanism is simple. Raise the cost of imported panels, and the domestic supplier gets breathing room. Now, the category of winners most people do not think about: the toll collectors. When the world adds friction, The people who sell friction management get paid. If you make more shipments go through formal entry and assessment, someone has to file forms, classify products, manage paperwork, handle disputes, and clear delays. That pushes business toward experienced logistics intermediaries, expediters, C.H. Robinson, and a whole ecosystem of compliance and data firms that sell screening and classification support. This is why a tariff regime can be supportive for certain service providers, even while it is inflationary for consumers. Now, the losers: import-dependent retailers and brands with thin margins and weak pricing power. If a retailer operates on a 3% net margin and tariffs plus processing costs add 1% of revenue and extra costs, that can wipe out a third of net profit. That is not theory. That is arithmetic. Now name the companies people will argue about. Walmart, Target, they have scale, they can negotiate, they can shift sourcing, they can manage inventory, but they are also tied to the consumer. If the consumer pulls back, volume falls. So they can be more resilient than small players, but they are not immune. Now Amazon, this is where the room starts yelling. Amazon can gain share in a crackdown regime if smaller sellers struggle with compliance, and if Amazon can offer a smoother landed cost experience through its network, scale becomes an advantage. But Amazon also lives on conversion and consumer demand. If prices rise and consumers buy less, the platform feels it. So Amazon is a mixed exposure. Direction depends on whether the crackdown shifts share toward Amazon more than it shrinks total demand. Now bring in the players that lived off the old side door. The ultra-low price cross-border model, the Temu and Shein style model, where millions of small shipments rode a duty-free threshold and fast shipping. When the threshold gets removed, the economics change. Either prices go up, or shipping slows, or assortment changes, or subsidies rise, or margins compress, or all of the above. If cheap goods rise in price, some consumers trade down further, some exit, and some shift back to domestic retailers. That is the reshuffle. It is not only punitive, it is redistributive. You did that. You treated shopping like a game of finding the cheapest link. You saved money for a while. You've paid because the system adapted, and adaptation is never free. Now connect this to inflation and rates, because this is where investors get blindsided. A tariff wave hits goods first. Goods inflation feeds expectations. Expectations shape rates. Rates shaped valuations. If goods inflation stays sticky, central banks get less room to cut. If rates stay higher for longer, long duration growth stocks get repriced because future cash flows are discounted harder. That is why a tariff story is also a stock valuation story. You can be holding a software company that imports nothing and still get hit because the discount rate moved and the consumer got squeezed. You did that. You thought tariffs only affect importers. You saved yourself from connecting the dots. You paid when the dots connected through rates. Now I want to give you a simple reality check that makes the scale tangible. If the government collects around $195 billion in customs duties in a year, and you spread that across something like 130 million households, that is roughly about $1,500 per household per year in border tax receipts. That does not mean every household pays the same amount directly. It means the machine is big enough that, in aggregate, the burden is real. It shows up as higher prices, lower discounts, weaker margins, slower growth, and higher rates that stick around. And you can feel this even if you never read a tariff document in your life. Now the practical part, the part that keeps you from being the person who pays twice, first time at the register, second time through inflation and rates. When hidden taxes rise, you do not want to be forced. You do not want to be the person who has to sell at the worst moment or who has to borrow at the highest rate. So the first move is boring, and it saves your future self. Build a cash buffer, reduce high interest debt. Because tariffs and inflation do not just raise prices. They raise the cost of money. And the cost of money is what traps people. Now, the second move, when tariffs become a revenue stream, there is an incentive to keep them. So you treat this like a regime, not a headline. You lean toward businesses with pricing power, businesses that can pass costs through without losing customers, and businesses that sell tools that help others navigate friction. You are not guessing. You are choosing based on who has margin buffer and who has leverage. Now, the third move, you watch the receipt, not the speech. Because the receipts are the signal. When customs duties print record months, pressure is real. When the de-minimized door closes, the cheap end of e-commerce gets heavier. When retailers talk about margin pressure and pricing actions, the bill is moving toward the consumer. And that is where we are now. If you got value so far, like the video, subscribe, and share it with a friend who buys everything online and thinks the price is always the real cost. Now, I am going to hand you 3 simple dials you can track weekly. And then I will run the numbers category by category so you can estimate which products get hit hardest, which companies have the margin buffer to survive, and where the next wave of price increase is most likely to show up first. 80, the 3 dials. And if you track nothing else, track these because they turn a political argument into a measurable pressure gauge. The first dial is receipts. Not speeches, receipts. When border taxes are rising, you see it in the monthly customs duties. You do not need a pundit to interpret it. The number tells you whether the machine is tightening or loosening. When the monthly take is rising fast, it means either the taxable base is growing, the tariff rates are rising, enforcement is tightening, loopholes are closing, or some combination of all 4. When the monthly take cools, it means volume is down, rates are down, enforcement is weaker, or the system found new side doors. And here is the part most people miss. Receipts can rise even if the economy slows, because tariffs can act like a fixed toll that collects even when households are stressed. That is why this can become politically tempting. It looks like free money. It feels like the other guy is paying, but it is not free. You did that. You watch the headlines and assume tariffs live in a foreign country. You saved time by ignoring the numbers. You paid because the numbers live at your border, and the border is upstream from your wallet. The second dial is prices in the specific categories that get hit first. Tariffs rarely hit everything evenly. They hit categories, and then those categories bleed into others. Apparel is a classic example. If a retailer sells a shirt for $20 and the landed cost rises by $2, that sounds small until you look at their margins. If their gross margin is 40%, then the cost is 60% of price. A $2 cost increase on a $12 cost base is more than 16%. That is not a rounding error. That is an earthquake inside a low margin business. Now, translate it into a store decision. The retailer can raise price, but demand might drop. They can keep price and accept lower margin, but then earnings fall. They can try to squeeze suppliers, but suppliers are already squeezed. They can reduce quality, which customers notice slowly. Or they can run more promotions, which hides price increases but destroys margin. That is why a tariff regime shows up not only as higher sticker prices, but also as fewer discounts, worse quality, and tighter return policies. You did that. You trained yourself to expect constant promotions. You saved money for a while. You paid when the promotions vanished and you thought it was corporate greed, when it was the cost stack shifting underneath them. So the second dial is a simple watch list of price behavior. Look for the categories where goods are standardized and price sensitive. Low-end home goods, basic apparel, small electronics, accessories, toys, kitchen items, discount retail baskets. If those categories start moving up while wages are not keeping pace, you get consumer stress, and consumer stress shows up in earnings calls. The third dial is routing. This is the dial that tells you whether the system is adapting around the rule. When tariffs and border friction rise, companies do not just accept pain. They change sourcing. They change assembly locations. They change shipping methods. They change packaging. They change product mix. They change pricing structure. This is where the side door becomes a maze. If one country is targeted, sourcing often shifts to another. Sometimes the work truly moves. Sometimes only the final assembly moves. Sometimes the paperwork moves more than the factory. But the result is the same, a reshuffle of supply chains. And that reshuffle has a cost. New suppliers mean new quality risk. New routes mean new logistics risk. New customs classifications mean new compliance risk. New factories mean new capex, and capex is not free. Capex is paid either by lower profits today or higher prices tomorrow. Now you see why tariffs can keep inflation sticky even when people assume inflation is only about energy. Because this is a structural cost increase and a structural friction increase, and friction does not disappear quickly. You did that. You believed globalization was a one-way road toward cheaper everything. You saved money for a while. You paid when the road became a detour. and detours always cost more fuel. Now let us run the household math again, because this is where the reality lands. If customs duty receipts rise by about $180 billion year over year, that is not an abstract number. That is a transfer spread across roughly 130 million households. That is on the order of $900 per household in that year of increase. Not as a neat bill in your mailbox, but as higher prices, fewer discounts, lower quality, slower delivery, and higher rates because inflation stays hotter than it would have been. Now compare that to the deficit. If the deficit is around 1.8 trillion and customs duties are around 200 billion, that is a bit more than 1/10. That means tariffs can never be a magic solution, but they can be a political instrument. They can be pointed at rivals, and they can be sold as painless while still generating real revenue. This is why you should expect tariff policy to persist once it becomes a revenue stream. It is hard to give up a cash machine, especially one that can be framed as protective. You assumed tariff policy was temporary. You saved yourself from planning for a regime. You paid because a regime reshapes business models, and business models reshape stock prices. Now, let us map the companies again, but this time in a way you can use immediately. There are three broad: the protected producers, the friction toll collectors, the exposed margin victims. Protected producers are the most obvious. When tariffs raise the price of imported steel and aluminum, domestic producers can see pricing power improve, at least when demand is stable. Nucor and Steel Dynamics are the kind of names that tend to benefit when domestic pricing holds and import competition is weakened. But you do not buy a protected producer on ideology. You buy it on the cycle. If construction slows and autos slow and manufacturing slows, protection helps less. Volume matters, so you watch demand indicators and you watch their realized prices and utilization. Now, domestic capacity in strategic categories. If policy creates a wall and subsidies create a floor, certain domestic manufacturers can live in a more comfortable zone. First Solar is one of the clearest examples in U.S. listed equities of a domestic solar manufacturing story that can benefit from a mix of policy support and import restrictions. Again, the mechanism is not politics. It is relative pricing and guaranteed demand through incentives. Now, the friction toll collectors, when customs paperwork rises, someone gets paid to navigate it. Forwarders, brokers, compliance vendors, logistics networks. Expeditors and C.H. Robinson can benefit when shippers need more help and when complexity rises, though they are still exposed to overall trade volumes. The point is, their services become more valuable when the system is harder to navigate. Now, the exposed margin victims, retail and brands that rely on cheap imported goods, thin margins, and price-sensitive consumers. If you run a business where your net margin is 2 or 3%, you cannot absorb much. A 1% hit to revenue from higher costs can erase 1/3 to 1/2 of your profit. This is why the discount retail ecosystem becomes a battleground. Dollar Tree and Dollar General live close to the consumer stress line. If costs rise and consumers are squeezed, volume can hold, but margin becomes the war. Now, big box retail, Walmart and Target have scale, distribution power, supplier bargaining power, and sourcing flexibility. That makes them more resilient than smaller retailers, but they are still tied to a consumer that becomes more price sensitive. They can offset some costs through private label, through better logistics, through supplier negotiations, and through mix changes, but they cannot repeal household math. Now, Amazon can gain share if smaller sellers cannot handle compliance friction and if Amazon provides a smoother landed cost experience. Scale becomes an advantage. But Amazon also depends on consumer demand and advertising budgets. If tariffs lift prices and demand slows, that can pressure parts of the ecosystem. So Amazon is not a simple winner or loser. It is a platform that can gain share even while the whole pie shrinks. Now, apparel brands, Nike, Gap, PVH, and similar names have varying sourcing footprints and varying pricing power. In a tariff and friction regime, the questions become brutal and simple. How much of cost of goods is exposed? How much margin buffer exists? How fast can they shift sourcing? How much pricing power do they actually have? If they raise price 5%, do they lose volume 10%? Because if that happens, their revenue falls and fixed costs do not fall as fast. That is how earnings collapse. You need that You bought brands for hype. You saved time by not asking where the product is made and how sensitive demand is. You paid when costs rose and customers bought. Now zoom out to the macro feedback loop, because this is where investors get blindsided. Tariffs push goods prices up. Goods prices push inflation expectations up. Inflation expectations keep rates higher. Higher rates compress valuations. Valuation compression hits stocks that are priced for perfect future growth. So even if you never import anything, you can still lose money because the discount rate moves. You did that. You thought tariffs only affect importers. You saved yourself from understanding the discount rate channel. You paid because the market is a machine that reprices everything when the cost of money changes. Now, what do you actually do with this? You stop trying to predict every headline. You build a posture. First, reduce forced selling risk. That means more liquidity than you think you need. That means less high interest debt than you think is normal. Because if tariffs keep inflation sticky, your debt becomes heavier. A credit card at 20% is not a tool, it is uninsured. Second, bias toward pricing power. Pricing power means the ability to raise prices without losing customers. It is not a slogan, it is measurable. Companies with strong brands, essential products, and tight supply can pass costs through. Companies in commodity-like retail categories often cannot. Third, understand your personal exposure. If a large share of your spending is goods, tariffs hurt more. Lower-income households spend a higher share on goods, necessities, and have less buffer. That makes tariffs function like a regressive tax in practice, even if the policy language is framed as patriotic. So if you are building a household plan, you prioritize essentials, avoid lifestyle creep financed by debt, and keep buffer. You did that. You assumed the system would always be forgiving. You saved nothing for shocks. You paid when a small cost increase turned into a big stress increase. Now, I promised you a simple way to estimate tariff impact without being an economist. You start with category. You ask, is this category dominated by imports? Then you ask, are the goods cheap and small where fixed border fees matter? Then you ask, are consumers price sensitive? Then you ask, what is the margin structure? If margins are thin, the company cannot eat the cost. Then you ask, what is the substitution option? If customers can easily switch, pricing power is weak. If customers cannot switch, pricing power is stronger. That is it. Those 6 questions will tell you whether a tariff wave is a nuisance or a profit killer. Now let me show you why the de-minimized shutdown is a bigger deal than most people realize. If you import a container full of goods, you already live in the formal system. You've already paid duties, brokerage, compliance. But if your model was millions of small parcels bypassing much of that, your business has to relearn the world overnight. You either consolidate shipments and use formal entry, which adds cost and time, or you raise prices, which hurts conversion, or you subsidize, which hurts margins, or you shrink assortment, which hurts retention. The cheap end of e-commerce was a psychological drug. It trained consumers to expect a thrill, cheap price, fast delivery, easy returns. When that thrill becomes more expensive, the consumer does not calmly accept it. They lash out. They complain. They reduce spending, and that is why this story is also about politics. Because tariff policy changes shopping behavior, and shopping behavior is a voter mood indicator. You did that? You thought consumer mood was about culture. You saved yourself from tracking the real driver, purchasing power. You paid when purchasing power slipped and markets got volatile. Now let us close the loop with the most controversial truth in this entire topic. The one that will light up the comments. Tariffs are a tax. They can protect certain domestic producers. They can push firms to diversify supply chains. They can reduce strategic dependency. All of that can be true. And yet, the way the system collects the money is through domestic importers and domestic consumers. That is why receipts can surge while households complain. It is not a contradiction. It is the mechanism. The border collects from the importer adjusts the price stack. The consumer feels it later. Sometimes months later. Sometimes hidden inside lower discounts and worse quality. Now, the final prize I promised you, the one habit that stops you from getting fooled again. Whenever you see a tariff headline, do not ask whether you agree. First, ask one thing. Is this policy raising the cost of imported goods, and by how much? Then ask the second thing, is the consumer strong enough to absorb it and are rates low enough to offset it? If the consumer is already stretched and rates are already high, a tariff wave is not just a trade story. It is an earnings story. It is a recession risk story. It is a valuation story. It is a portfolio story. Now, I want you to do something practical right now. If you want me to keep building these episodes where we turn policy into numbers and numbers into a money map, subscribe. If this changed how you see tariffs, like the video, and share it with one friend who thinks tariffs are paid by the other country, because that one misunderstanding will cost them real money over the next few years. In the next episode, we can go one layer deeper and build a live scoreboard you can update weekly, customs receipts, price movement in exposed categories, and sourcing diversion signals, so you can see the pressure building before the market prices it in.